I'm going to begin by introducing Simon. And I should say straight away that, again, it's wonderful that Simon's here because he is actually really not very well with COVID at the moment. So he's not been able to join us in person, but he's very valiantly said he'll do his presentation from elsewhere. So Simon Batterbury, as several of you will know, was a professor here in at Lancaster for many years, a professor, in fact, the first professor of political ecology at Lancaster. But in recent times, he's moved out to Australia and he's now Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Melbourne. And the research he's going to be talking about today very significantly is research that he started here in the UK when he was at Lancaster and is now able to complete as part of this British Academy Fellowship. So I think with that, over to Simon.
Thank you very much. I'll try and, I don't know how to use Zoom, but what are we on? No, we're on Teams, aren't we? There we go. Can you see that screen?
Sorry, Simon, we can't hear you at the moment.
Hold on. Teams. Right, is that it? My microphone is showing that it's on.
Simon, do you want to try again? Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. That's fantastic.
Thank you. I thought that was going to work. Okay, I'll try and go back to my talk. Can you see that one?
Yes.
Is that all right? See some cats?
Yes.
Okay.
Handing them to you.
Right. I'm feeling a bit rough and I had a strong coffee and I'll try not to cough too much. First time I ever got COVID. I never got it when I lived in other countries. But anyway, here on sabbatical, I managed to get it. So I'm speaking from down south and I'm really sorry I'm not there. In 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is give you some new and a little bit of old information about community bicycle workshops or bike kitchens. As you can see on the screen, this funding comes from British Academy. It was very gracious. It's the first time I've had a grant like that, really, to just simply focus on a particular thing for a decent length of time. And there's some previous funding that came up that started all of this off going on 10 years ago now. I'm actually known for doing other types of work, grueling issues in the global south I look at, particularly in the Francophone Pacific, where there's currently riots and problems with the decolonization process in New Caledonia. But this has always been my secondary interest, so it's nice to bring it to the fore. And this one is quite sociological too. So the aims of this particular British Academy project is to look at how do selected British bike workshops create demand for urban cycling and also support active travel, building on previous work. What are the motivations and the government's arrangements of these community workshops, because they sit in the community economy sector. What sorts of alliances do they make? What practices and skills do people working there learn? Are they socially just? And there's a lot of politics around that particular question. And what sort of clientele do they reach and how successful are they? And the third one, with a particular interest in sociology at Lancaster, are they somehow prefiguring a low carbon future where we probably learn to fix our own modes of transport, not just using it, as part of the official agendas, which are all about sustainable mobility and support bicycles generally. So are there lessons for urban practice and different types of community economies research, and also transition theory, which is occupying us greatly? Seems like we're not talking about climate change anymore. It's all about transitions to something better and new. And the last aim was casually thrown in at number 4 was to finish a communally authored open access book in the tradition of Mattering Press or another one of those presses with my collaborators from across the world to get that done, and I've made a start. So the methods here would be of interest for a mobilities audience. Excuse me. I've been entirely mobile since February. You can see the way in which I've traveled there. I've got a folding bike and I've got my red bag and I've got my laptop bag, and that is it. And I haven't really stayed anywhere for more than 3 or 4 days in the entire period between UK, France, Austria mainly. And I've simply set up and volunteered in different bike workshops around workshop history, personnel and their labour, patterns, business models, challenges, etc. The entire study has about 60 workshops visited over a long period, and the ones I focused on in this period were particularly down the bottom there around the UK, and I focused on the North and Scotland for much of that. I didn't use recording. Many people did not want to be recorded. I didn't have set questions. I did, however, conduct a few formal interviews with directors of bike workshops along the way. Also, my positionality as a sort of old British man, as you can see, I have the right accent to to work with some of the groups I talked with. Not correct for others up north and in Scotland, but I actually run a workshop myself on a daily basis in my ample spare time on a Saturday, helping build up bikes for refugees in Australia called We Cycle. And I also have been fixing bikes since learning from street traders back in Ouagadougou in the 90s when I was doing my research in post-socialist Burkina Faso. So there we go. And I use a particular rather exotic looking bike, which is quite popular for people to chat about. So just a few words about cycling. Yes, it's not one of the most popular modes of getting around in the UK, but there was a renaissance of urban cycling, I think, as the climate emergency began to bite, and austerity as well, because it's cheap. It features strongly in urban sustainability transitions thinking and literature, because it's part of what Hendlin calls a low-hanging fruit to reduce CO2 emissions. A bit less so for e-bikes, which are really coming in, particularly in the UK. And bikes can be a just form of transport because they sort of erase class, gender, wealth differences quite effectively. They're cheap and they're accessible to almost all people, obviously not all people, and they're simple to fix generally. But they're also, of course, objects of passion and desire, which came up in this research, although less so than the kind of mechanics of supplying bikes to people who need them. Repairing them isn't just a skill either. It's also something that's necessary to keep a bike on the road. Otherwise, they sit in a shed doing nothing, or they go into a skip. But it's also a social activity in certain settings, and that this is the repair itself, not going on cycle rides in the fells in Lancashire. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about actually fixing them together. And that's one of my famous fixer friends, Inez, who learned her skills in one of the Brussels workshops that I worked in a previous field work. The next thing I want to say is that there's a supply-demand issue around bicycle, getting people on bikes. The majority of bicycle planning focuses on supply of mobility options through better infrastructure, cycle lanes, bike share, bike parking. The most expensive I saw in my entire travels this year was the that big emergency tunnel which goes right through the middle of Lyon in France, and is basically now, that's all a bike lane, and the emergency vehicles can run down the other side when necessary, but private cars are now completely banned. And that's one of the cases where there's been a complete flip of transport options down that tunnel, and it's 3 miles long, I think, 3.5 kilometers. So this requires improving supply means a lot of money, technical expertise. In Britain, it's the budget that we don't currently have for retooling local roads on the local road network. There's obviously money for, building smart motorways like on the M6, but the budget for local stuff is pretty slim. In Lancaster, it's absolutely dreadful. I had another word with the Dynamo project, and goodness me, nothing's happened since I left in 2019. Bit of paint on the roads, maybe. And also there's access and other issues there, control over road space. And we've had some pretty awful responses to cycling, people complaining about those local traffic-free networks and so forth. And who knows if that will get better after the election. What interests me, though, is what seemed to be absent in my entire life of cycling since the 1970s, what the French called vélonomie, which is gaining of skills in bike repair and how to ride effectively. These are part of what I would say is on the demand side. Demand for cycling is social, it's the human infrastructure rather than the actual infrastructure. So if we can somehow increase demand for cycling, as is taken for granted in countries like the Netherlands, well, to some extent in some cities, then we are actually putting people on the bikes on the infrastructure that has already been created or that will be created. Some of the aspects of that in the literature are cycling as a style function, bicycle justice issues, particularly around race at the moment. In marginalized communities, bike protest is a thing. All of this follows Lefebvre, who mentioned bikes a couple of times in his famous literature on urban struggles. Collective actions fighting for the streetscape and rights to public space in general. People's low carbon mobility choices, fighting to get access to better ones. And also fitness and efficiency. So all of these things are what actually puts people on the bike. The infrastructure doesn't put people on the bike. So repair of a bicycle is part of this gritty side of sustaining demand for cycling. And it doesn't have to be simply devolved to bike shops. The workshops, what I'm looking at here is essentially a not-for-profit community-based organization formed around the restoration and maintenance of bicycles, and there are two types. The first is where you work independently or autonomously, as is called in France, on your own bike. There's a space, there's volunteers, there are tools, there are used parts, and you simply go there. You say hello, and you ask if you can fix your bike, and if necessary, somebody may give you a hand. Otherwise, it's just a space where you fix up your mode of transport. And B is workshops where the prime activity is fixing bikes to help others. So that's a very clear sort of A and B distinction, which I'll break down in a minute. Both types are, of course, committed to low carbon sustainable mobility or grassroots solutions to mobility issues. All my interviews that I've just done, people have a belief, rightly or wrongly, in bikes as part of the solution to mobility issues. People in Manchester, for example, are so happy that there are decent canal side paths that actually are beginning to be a connected network, that you can actually cycle through the middle of the city without getting killed now, even in winter with the shocking slippery road surfaces. Some of those have been improved. Generally, they're part of an urban commons, usually open to all people. So they're part of a broad a Bourdieu type of social field of citizens, workers, volunteers across gender, race and age. And I mean that sincerely, because I'm one of the rare people that probably has some evidence to justify that last statement. You can see, by the way, my own team that I work with in my little workshop in Melbourne there, are all looking particularly happy. So we have in there ex-refugees, we have people from different backgrounds and genders and so forth. And there's a commitment in all of these workshops to innovate and reuse stuff effectively, cheaply, and to transmit knowledge to others. Some activist campaigns come out of them, and there's also nascent social enterprises that grow from some of the initial bike workshops. If you thought these were tiny little backroom initiatives, look at that top. That's Recycle Your Bike in the suburb of Byker in Newcastle. And it really does exist in Byker, and they think this is very funny. But it is a huge operation, and they give away bikes to people in need. They sell other bikes to keep that going. Down there is the Anarchists Bike Kitchen in Vienna. I spent some time in. That's the most disorganized one. And also to make any decisions in that environment is pretty difficult. And there's our own one there. So the question is, what is going on in these spaces? The first thing is, at the top, we have bikes and parts as an anchor, as a material set of objects. Then we have volunteer workers who assist, and some are paid in fact, in these workshops. Then we have people with their bike problems. And those are people who, want to fix, or they desire to own a bike, or they're looking for parts and skills. So this is a kind of workshop assemblage, basic. And then we can add in the building, the organization, which people have registered and set up, except for the anarchists, because they haven't registered anything. And then knowledge and skills that those people have, and those become part of different non-market-based transactions at a broader scale. The Kropotkin-esque mutual aid concept describes some of those very well. I've written a paper about that, but I'm not going to go into it. And there's different outside networks that the workshop can belong to. Workshops, this is for the geographers, but they're basically mostly in inner cities, particularly in the UK, sometimes amongst populations with particular needs. So in Manchester, there's a couple in the south, in up-and-coming suburbs like Sale, but still reaching poorer areas around. UK workshops are opportunistic. The big social enterprise ones can almost afford market rents, particularly when those were diminished during COVID. So Bike for Good, that's a crappy photo, but you can see the bike fleet of Glasgow being repaired by the organisation Bike for Good there. And they have 2 workshops, and they have to bring in about 200,000 a year in money to pay for rents and other costs, and they have several paid staff as well. The Leeds workshop has help from donors, but it's down near the docks, but they're losing their premises, and there are a few of these massive workshops, but premises are often unstable. The variance in aims and missions can be actually, I think, folded into 3 rather than 2. So the first is the volunteer community workshop, working towards Velonomie, and that is just a commitment that the organisation holds to getting people on bikes, no questions asked, really. France is the world centre for this, and I mean really the world centre for this. I've traced 419 such workshops across that country. Numbers are increasing all the time into the smaller towns and cities. The UK has a really long way to go. I hardly found anything in the UK on my travels that approximates to a volunteer community workshop open to all. They do exist. Mostly walk-in repairs are done in workshops that have other missions as well, like the famous Bristol bike workshop, or Bike for Good in Leeds, or in Glasgow, or the Leeds one, or even in men's sheds, where there is the possibility to use tools and have somebody help you, but the organisation itself does other things. And there's rules around this, and there's also sessions for women, non-binary and trans in the ones in Bristol, in Brighton, and so on. Secondly is a workshop, and this is the common model in the UK, workshops that have paid labour, they have some staff, they have shop pricing for repairs, they are officially social enterprises or for-purpose organisations. They fundraise for particular charities sometimes, as with the the Manchester charity bike shop shown there, where they raise money for the hospital, for a charity for a cancer organisation. But they have second-hand parts and bikes. So this is like a shop, but it sells second-hand stuff as well. There's a few from around the world there. The largest in the world, by the way, is Working Bikes in Chicago, which is absolutely massive. Serves the whole of the Midwest and gives out bikes to people in need, and as far away as Africa as well. They get income from bike repair, bike sales, so income can go up to $500,000 a year from those types of activities. Bike for Good in Glasgow is one of the country's biggest, and this is a social enterprise model. Interviewing the director, they said, we were doing well until after COVID, when demand for bicycles dropped off, and then suddenly we were in trouble. So they've had a GoFundMe campaign to keep going. There's limited opportunities for people to fix their own bikes. Lastly, I found workshops with a particular mission. This includes my own, where we only work with asylum seekers and refugees. We give away 300 fixed bikes a year, and we're all volunteers, and we toil to do that every week. Other examples in the UK is the Julian House project in Bath, the Lancaster Bike Project, which is funded by a City of Sanctuary. Well, it's not funded by anybody actually, and it's hidden away. It doesn't advertise, and I worked with them for 2.5 years. Are they really community workshops? Because the community is sometimes a bit excluded. Well, community members can join and train and become volunteers, and they are social bike spaces. So I've kind of included them here. The people and the clientele, these crazy people, volunteers I found are very wide-ranging. They're more or less, some are more or less multilingual, because the audience for refugees and asylum seekers requires that. People have varying skills. There's some diversity in volunteer bases. I didn't find any evidence of the exclusion of women in the UK. There's much talk in the literature of unfriendly spaces. Certainly, I think the new politics around diversity are beginning to filter through into this sector, which doesn't have great regulation, but ones with employment and have to meet employment law too. There's variable ethnicity, age, and gender as a result, and usually a founder or a key person as well. And social enterprise staff go from those who've exited from corporate world. The head of Bike for Good in Glasgow is burnt out from being a corporate exec in France, and he spent 20 years building up that organization, to sort of more careerist regional social organizers, as in the case in Newcastle, and they've all got huge dedication behind them. Almost at the end, there's several forms of networks and linkages that bike workshops are part of. However, I did not find this in the UK. In France, the membership of Le Recyclage, kind of happy cycling, is about 300 of the 400 and something workshops, and they share information. They even move parts around in the major cities to supply each other. They have training workshops. They have an annual meeting. We don't have much like that in the UK. So if you're UK, you have to speak French and go across to the French place for an annual meeting about bike workshops. That's the easiest thing to do. There's some ambivalence about networking among some volunteer workshops. The anarchist one in Vienna, for example, prefers to work with people in Bratislava, which is 60 kilometers away, I think, from Vienna. They're not so keen on the other workshops in Vienna. They're a little bit more conventional in terms of governance and politics than they are. So Recyclage is the world's biggest network, but there's also Bike, which extends all the way up and down Canada, US, and into Mexico and beyond. And they do have an online annual workshop. They used to have face-to-face. In a city like Melbourne, where I live, where there's 5 million people, we have a bicycle recyclers group with about 30 members, and we debate what are the needs of the population, who's got access to premises, can we temporarily store bikes at each other's places, etc. And links to the state. There's quite a lot of ambivalence in this community sector. Even in kind of, post-socialist Macronist France, people sometimes don't like taking federal money. That's beginning to change as we're moving into transitions funding within the EU for recycling, and making sure that stuff stays out of the waste stream. And there are, of course, shared events, some of them quite radical, like critical mass activity. So to conclude, repair is a powerful thing, I think, in a world of concern about resource use now. Repair combines material practices. You have to actually learn stuff and do stuff. And in a bike workshop, this means set within a community economy in webs of bike spaces. These are, for many of the people I talk with, extremely liberating spaces. I've talked with people who have found themselves, who've, as part of personal recovery or post incarceration, working within these workshops and finding that they have a purpose, even if it's just a small purpose of fixing bikes for people in need. Workshops build demand for cycling, therefore they're in both material and symbolic ways. The symbolic ways is partly what I want to try and get at with this book, is to show that they exist, because nobody really writes about them other than about 30 or 40 people across the entire world. In sociology, you could probably name all the people that work on this topic on fingers of one hand, including Peter Cox, of course, but others further afield. Yes, there are a few. Workshops are practically important in the UK, but they often struggle with the state of the country, austerity, lack of funding, and they traverse different publics, but they are hit with the same austerity issues as everybody else. And just a quote from one of my previous articles with Alejandro Manga in the Handbook of Bicycle 2 or 3 years ago. Desire of urban planners and some political actors to increase cycling mode share, particularly in cities, to moving towards sustainable mobilities and lower carbon forms of transport, is unlikely to succeed without cultural change, which is what we've been getting at in this project. It also requires recognition of diversity and the social life of the bike and its users. We call this the bike space, complementing and feeding the material changes to the supply of cycling infrastructure. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Giovanni. Can everybody hear me now? So we're going to open this up for conversation. So I think the plan, Jen, is I'll take questions from the room, and well, between us, we'll field questions from the online audience. I should say there's many more of you online than there are in the room. So please pitch in and share your thoughts and observations with us. That's why we're here, to hear you. So. Yes, we've got Giovanni in the room. Giovanni.
Can you hear me, Simon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you very, very much for the presentation and mapping. I had a question that picks on something you just mentioned, that is e-bikes. This is something that, according to many, is very positive, as it kind of widens the pool of people that might be using a bike, and it allows, kind of also longer commuting and so on. It makes it more accessible. I don't know. I've never looked into that really, but very often we hear positive things about e-bikes and so on. But your only remark about that seemed to be less positive in terms of the increased CO2 emissions and so on. Can you just explain a bit how you come across e-bikes in your research and what it could entail for the type of also collective spaces that you've been investigating?
Thank you. Yes, attitudes go from, so the anarchists in Vienna and some of the other places I visited in France won't even allow an e-bike across the threshold. They just refuse to deal with them, arguing that they're consumers of carbon and so forth, even in France, which of course has tons of nuclear energy. So they are aware of the entire production consumption chain for an e-bike, and the problem is often with the battery tech, which requires critical minerals. It requires quite a large amount of stuff, which is hard to get. However, yes, on the streets, those arguments have not been swayed people, stopped them from buying them, and they are pretty extensive in all the countries I've lived and worked in. I myself, of course, built one myself entirely from scrap parts, and with advancing age and health and poor health, and find it something to use sort of in an emergency and when I can't manage. And I think that's the way a lot of people like me, bike enthusiasts, treat them. Generally, the electronic skills are not available in the general workshop volunteers to fix these. They are beginning to come. I tap into the French listservs where these issues are discussed on a daily basis about mechanics and directors of workshops and so forth, and they're beginning to leak now into the workshop, and people are beginning to work on them. They obviously have mechanical stuff that needs fixing, and they have electronics which often people don't have knowledge of, and you can blow yourself up, so it's a bit difficult if you're in an unsafe space like some of the ones I've shown you. So there are some health and safety risks with tapping a battery to see what's going on with its charging, and also rebuilding cells. If you want to rebuild cells in Britain, the best place is in a Glasgow suburb, where they do that very effectively. But there's a whole parallel set of shops being developed across the country. You see them where they fix up people delivering pizzas and their bikes. And so I didn't feel really ready to go into those, but they're not workshops. So I don't think there's a community workshop for e-bikes at the moment, hence the fleeting mention.
you. Question from Nicola Sperling. Okay.
Thanks, Simon. At the start, you had the question about are these cycling workshops prefiguring a low carbon system? And I wondered how are you going about conceptualizing that idea of prefiguration and reaching conclusions about that question?
Yes. I think because I've seen so many, I've got quite a range of now of the different types. And I think prefiguration actually takes different forms in the different countries I've worked in. So in the French system with recyclage, the future is lots of people cycling and on conventional bikes largely, and learning to fix them themselves, d'être vélonome, to be, bicycle sort of autonomous in terms of riding skills and fixing skills. They say that's prefiguring a low carbon future for France, where resources are going to be scarcer, and we should learn to fix those things ourselves. If you go across to the Netherlands, bikes are just there, they're used every day. Nobody's that bothered about fixing them because there's lots of little shops along the streets which do it for you. And I studied in Ouagadougou, La Ville de Derou, the city of two wheels in West Africa. And, bicycle mechanics made their living from fixing bikes. So there's a tension between these types of community bike workshops and interfering with trades. In the Netherlands, however, the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam now has its own bike workshop, and they're beginning to go in there. In the UK, there's ample ways in which these can sit along bike workshops, because they deal with second-hand parts and bikes. And I think that is a prefiguration. If you think of a sci-fi movie in a post-apocalyptic Britain, people are going to be grabbing stuff and trying to get it working, and that's exactly what these types of workshops are prefiguring, I think. You see the most amazing technical ways in which people adapt bike parts to work, given limited resources. And they're even finding things like other types of fluids than petrocarbon oils to grease chains and things like that. Those guys are pretty full on, actually. I've only met them once in France. So their prefiguration is we just don't use as much stuff, but of course it's in the rubber tires too. So I like the idea of prefiguration, and that's what Gibson Graham talked about a lot in their work on community economies too, that some of the organizations they've dealt with over the years are kind of ahead of the game.
And if we've got any questions from online audience?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Nick, would you like to ask that I could switch your sound on? I think. Allow mic. So Nick, if you would like to ask your question, you could just ask it. If I don't hear anything from you, I will read it out. I'll just go ahead. Oh, no, I can't hear you, Nick. I'll just read it out. Although I think everyone can see it. But yeah, so Nick says, thank you for your talk, Simon. I'm interested in the reception of you and your work by the groups you visit and work with. I know as a cyclist that there's a whole lingo in bike mending workshops through which one is required to signal belonging. How does your ability or inability to talk the talk across cultures affect your access to different groups?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I had a fleeting mention of positionality. I'm very aware of it from my other work, which is in very tense multiracial environments in the Pacific. And what's helped, I think, first of all, I speak French almost not completely fluently, but well enough to deal with bike parts and so forth. So over there, I'm accepted a little bit more than I would be if I was the bumbling Anglophone asking basic questions. Secondly, I do know the names of parts, and there is a sociality to bike fixing, and it tries not to be too macho, but it can occasionally be about Oh, I had one of those bikes and I did the tour of whatever in Italy and so on. I try not to get into that stuff. There's, however, I just recently had an extremely interesting encounter in London with a fixer who came up to me in the shop and said, "Oh, we're not busy. Let's sit down and have a chat." And this is a man who has a completely different positionality to me, and we had the most amazing discussion. And a lot of it is about inter-country differences and being half Australian and things like that. But then we get into the nitty-gritty of how the bikes there are fixed and operated on, and what the purpose of these organizations is. And people like to hear that they're not isolated in the UK. They often go to work in a workshop, or they go to a workshop to buy a bike because they've Googled and discovered there's a shop locally, but they don't really know much else about what goes on. Nobody seems to go around visiting other workshops. Nobody up in Newcastle has ever been to a workshop down south or knows anything about what goes on in London. And I'm able to give a little bit of a background, and I think that's probably quite helpful for people. But as I said, I don't record these interviews, and as a result, it's a free-flowing conversation, really. The only time I've run into trouble is in the famous bike kitchen in San Francisco, where they just didn't want anybody visiting and they're fed up with researchers, which is something you have to respect. I also volunteer my time, so I spent up to a day volunteering in a workshop, dismembering bikes, fixing a problem, and that builds trust.
No more. Thanks, Simon. That was
Simon.
great.
Thank you.